All right, we are live, so to speak. Claire, Joe, welcome to Talking Engagement. Thank you very much for joining me.
Hello, Ben.
Hello.
Lovely to be here.
Great stuff. So for anyone who hasn't heard of you both, do you want to give us a quick run through of who you both are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm Claire. I live just outside York, in the north of the country. I'm passionate about helping organisations align their people with their purpose and also their ambitions for their customers. My background is marketing, communications and strategy, and I would say probably the last 15 years I've been working with organisations and teams to help them, work on things to do with their organisation, their culture, how they engage their people, their leaders, how they actually become more customer-centric organisations. That's what drives me, that's what I love doing, and that's sort of how Joe and I came to meet, actually.
Yeah, so Claire and I work together in a large corporate organisation doing all things culture and engagement, and decided then to set up on our own as Curious Jellyfish. And my background's been finance into commercial, into culture and transformation, etc., all things people. Really want to create places where people can do their best work and succeed, because I've been in situations where it's not been a great environment and I haven't been able to do my best work. So I wanted to change that for others.
Fantastic. Well, I think I am well and truly convinced that I have two of the best possible people for the purpose of this podcast. We are all about actionable insights that help make your culture better and make work better for everybody. So I'm really excited to have you both on. So I suppose we'll kick off with a little bit of the work that I know Curious Jellyfish have been doing. So if you want to give us a little lead into Curious Jellyfish as a whole, that's fine. But I understand that you've both, been conducting some research as it relates to what the future of work might look like. And is there anything that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we did some research because we wanted to really tap into what organizations were going through and how they were responding, so we could enable kind of that reflection. And obviously Claire and I aren't in large corporations at the moment, so we wanted to get underneath the skin of that and see what was really happening. So we surveyed about 250 people. We spoke to around 30 CEOs and MDs in terms of in-depth interviews. And there was loads of things that came out, and trying to distill it was actually the difficult part. But there were a load of positives as well, Ben, because I think, and everybody was in panic mode initially. But when we look back and reflect on it, there were kind of 4 key themes, which I think can be really positive, and we can take a lot away from that. So theme 1 was around the increased connection to the team and the organization. So there's definite kind of camaraderie and bringing people together. I mean, people had one kind of purpose, which was to keep the business alive and to stay safe. I think that definitely kind of increased those connections. And there was an amplification of trust and empowerment, because people were working from home or virtual working, etc. A lot of decisions had to be made, and people gave more trust and more accountability and empowerment, which I think is something that we'd want to see more of. I'm sure many people would agree. The third theme was around the acceleration of strategy. So not just digital strategy. We know, we had thousands of people working from home overnight in many organizations, but also customer and brand strategy, putting those elements at the forefront of the decision making. And then the fourth one, I don't think it's a surprise to many people, but that remote working is not the panacea. So, it's not a one size fits all. People are in different situations that we need to take account of. But on the whole, people are enjoying more flexibility. So those were kind of the 4 key themes. And then we wanted to start to try and understand, how do people maintain these positives and what do they learn from it? That's kind of a bit of a summary of our research. Claire, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, it's a great summary, Joe. Really great summary. I mean, one of the things that we were really keen to was try and look for the positives and the opportunities that organisations could use the crisis, rather than seeing everything in a negative light, but how could they actually learn from stuff? What sort of experiments did it force them to have to take? What things did they have to try new that maybe they not wanted to do before or been reluctant to do that. So part of our findings and our report is trying to get organisations to think differently a little about some of those things and how they can, you know, take confidence from that and try some new things, pay attention to those things a bit more maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, it's a really interesting tack to take with people, because I think I've had people say to me certainly that, you know, things like moving to remote working and things have kind of been part of a 5-year plan for an organization, and then they've had to kind of fit it into something like 5 months. So, you know, you sort of touched on it there, Joe, in the sense that, you know, necessity becoming the mother of invention for a lot of these initiatives. And it seems like for some people, there's a real clamor to sort of put all this to one side and let's just focus on bringing sort of our organization back to how it was. And for others, it seems to, you know, almost be an opportunity to build on things and to kind of take the learnings. And I think that one of the ways in which, well, no, sorry, what is interesting is how, you know, you have taken the positive tack on it, you know, and it's not been a case of let's use this as an opportunity to, you know, hide away, batten down the hatches, stay siloed. It's an opportunity to actually experiment and sort of push the boundaries of what can work and what can be beneficial going forward.
Yeah, and I think on that, Ben, I think a lot of people talk about the future of work and like, oh, we need to define the future of work. And actually the future of work is whatever we want it to be. You know, in every single organization, we've all got choices, and people have choices about how they run the organization and what that working pattern looks like. And it's really up to us as individuals and, you know, as part of larger organizations to say, how do we want to work going forward? What has worked really well? What hasn't? And then how do we maintain or amplify that? And I think that's what Claire was talking about in terms of intention and awareness of what has worked well.
I think one of the other things, just to kind of touch on this very briefly, was that it was kind of CEOs and MDs that you both spoke with, because, you know, primarily the people that I speak to, they're kind of more, I suppose, more ingrained in the HR focus of the organization. But of course, you know, I'm sure you'd both agree that kind of that culture and that people centricity has to start sort of at the very top of the organization, as it were. So, you know, did you both find that sort of the MDs and the CEOs that you spoke to were really clued in when it came to this type of thing, or were they canvassing opinion from the rest of the business as it related to the answers that they gave?
I think it was mixed. I think generally I'd say everybody we spoke to was certainly very focused on their people and very comfortable talking about what they've been learning, what they've been experiencing, and very happy to chat about watch outs and things that they had concerns about. There was some great honesty from some of them around how they've been very reluctant to adopt remote working and let people remote work, how they didn't expect themselves to be able to work in that way, and that they've been totally reversed their opinions of it. There was definitely a focus on people. There was definitely a focus on thinking, how do we actually move forward in this way? A lot of them said, we can't go back to how it was before. We don't think it works to go back, but actually we're not quite sure how to go forward and make this part of how we work normally. So I don't know, Joe, was there anything that struck you about the conversations with some of the people that we did speak to?
Yeah, I think one of the things was actually how it seemed to me that they were quite in tune with their people. So that they'd had a lot of conversations around, you know, mental health, how people were coping. And they also recognized that not everyone is in the same position. So a lot of the people, as you can imagine, CEOs and MDs, you know, have an office, have space that they can work at home very comfortably, whereas others don't. But they did recognize that. I think it was interesting when we spoke to leaders in manufacturing organizations and service organizations. Obviously, there's some people that can't work from home because they're out on the road, or in customers' homes or in the factory, etc. So there was the very real recognition that there could be a bit of a them and us type of mentality arising from the office people being able to work from home, and then others having to kind of face that.
Yeah. Sorry, Claire.
And I do think quite a lot of them mentioned it felt like much more of a leveler, particularly the use of video and communications, and the fact that people were sitting in their kitchens or their bedrooms or their offices at home, etc. And that all the normal artifacts of, you know, status and leadership, etc., had all disappeared. And I think people found that engaging, but also found it easier to connect with people. And a lot of leaders, I think, talked about their engagement scores and things, which is quite interesting. You don't always see that as the first thing that they talk about, but there did seem to be a sense of pride in what they'd been doing and how they'd allowed themselves to focus on their people and think differently. And there was one person we spoke to who was running a manufacturing company who'd said, look, we're absolutely thankful and can't believe how our employees worked so hard and were so flexible and had kept this organisation going, and we feel we want to recognise and reward that, and was really honest about saying we haven't maybe looked after them as well as we should have done in the past. We've maybe not talked to them about how they would like to work. We know we're going to need them in the factory, but what does flexibility look like for them? So I definitely felt like a lot of the leaders we spoke to were more awake to the needs of their people, and actually this was a moment in time to start to think about things differently, that they could think about things differently, that it's okay to actually think about your people and put them first as well. So I felt quite lifted by that. And I felt quite lifted that quite a lot of the leaders didn't necessarily know how they were going to address some of those things either. And we would definitely encourage them to keep talking to your people, you know, because together you'll work it out and you'll work out what the right things are to do. But yeah, I think we were quite inspired by some of the conversations we had, weren't we, Joe?
Gives me hope for the future.
No, absolutely. I love hearing that. I think that more organizations getting together and sort of using teamwork and real employee feedback for basing future decisions and change on is absolutely the way forward. I want to go back to something that you mentioned there, Joe. So you talked about sort of higher, advocacy scores and that sort of increased feeling of camaraderie and things. Yeah. So we would probably see that, you know, that's to me in my world, and I'm sure to you both, that's the ENPS score that we're talking about there, or amongst the, you know, you could summarize it in that. I mean, is it as simple as sort of a sense of it's that camaraderie? It's we're all in it together. Do you think that was sort of that's the big inspiration behind that? And I suppose the flip question to that is that should organizations be prepared for sort of a what goes up must come down sort of swing in that as well?
Yeah, I think in terms of what's driven it, I think it is, and people say a crisis brings out the best in teams, don't they? Mm-hmm. And I think it is quite evident that it has. So it's the camaraderie. I think it's the purpose, you know, galvanizing everybody together. I think it's been the increased communication. So a lot of organizations have really ramped up talking to their people, both in terms of frequency and also in terms of honesty and transparency. So I think there's a multitude of things there that can account for the higher ENPS scores and engagement scores. And I think that kind of what goes up must come down. I don't think that's the case. I think there's a danger of that, especially because what we've seen is that it could be just a temporary thing. So people have viewed it and kind of through the whole crisis, it was this crisis will be over. We will get back to normal. So the adrenaline of a crisis can spike, and then there's a dip afterwards. So there's that to be aware of. And I think it's for organizations to pay attention to the drivers of their ENPS and be really deliberate about how to maintain it. Claire, I don't know whether you've got anything to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant question, Ben, because I think lots of organisations have seen a bounce in their engagement scores, and that's brilliant. You know, that's fantastic. That's what we're all trying to see happen. And we know, I mean, I spent a lot of time in, you know, looking at engagement surveys, trying to get underneath what's going on, really trying to track trends and help organisations work out where they can focus. And we often see there's a really strong uptick in teams that have got strong alignments to their organisation's purpose, where they feel quite empowered, where they're getting on with their work, where they feel very supported by their leader and the strong alignment. We always see that as a trend in engagement surveys anyway. And I think what it's done as the crisis is created that at an organisation-wide level, because it was really clear what had to be done. It was very simple. Leaders were very, very transparent around, this is about survival, it's about looking after you, it's about looking after our customers. So I think all those great things we always say we want organisations to pay attention to when it comes down to engagement sort of were created through the crisis, which is brilliant, you know, and actually it shows that organisations can do this. I think my worry about whether it will be a bounce or not is a little bit to Joe's point. Were employees more tolerant of their organisations? Were they feeling more grateful because they were still in a role that they would maybe been furloughed or supported or able to work from home, were given flexibility? You know, was that coming through in their scores? Probably. It doesn't mean to say it will go back down again. A couple of leaders we were talking to more recently were saying that they were noticing that some of their customer satisfaction scores were starting to come down. So one of the things that some organisations saw during the crisis was their actually customer satisfaction scores went up, which seems very, very odd given that people were trying to speak to people when they were at home with dodgy Wi-Fi, where systems were falling over, where systems were going slow. But I think customers were tolerant. It was, again, that feeling we're all in it together, we're being caring of each other, we're respectful of the fact that people are going through different things. But actually some firms are starting to see their customer satisfaction scores go down because customers are becoming less tolerant, because things are becoming and feeling a bit more normal. So our expectations have shifted. And it did make me wonder, might that happen with employees? So as things start to feel a little bit more normal or a little bit like they used to be, do employees start to feel the same way again? Do they start to switch on? Does the muscle memory come back? Do they start to say, oh, I'm not as tolerant as that anymore? Surely we shouldn't be letting that fly anymore. You know, leaders need to step up. And I'm not saying that will happen. I think it's just a little watch out. I mean, my big thing, and Joe said it, was if you're running engagement surveys, run them because you want to take action, run them because you want to have a conversation with your people about what's going on, what's behind that data. Don't just run them because you want to measure and you want to get a score, because actually it's a totally wasted opportunity. So I think there's been lots of great stuff for organisations to learn from in the crisis, and they should use it as a springboard and realise that some of this stuff makes a difference and they can keep doing it. So probably a long answer for if what goes up, does it come back down? But, you know, that's just my feelings on it, and it's something I've been mulling over.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would really kind of echo what you're both saying there. I mean, I think that, you know, the answer to, you know, if it goes up, does it have to come down? The answer is, you know, not necessarily. And I think that for every business that wants to see, let's say, you know, a tangible, not ROI necessarily, but like a tangible effect of having done something, you've seen that, you know, largely off the back of this research, that, you know, where trust has been given more freely, the ability to work more autonomously has been offered. People have been offered, you know, greater flexibility. There's been, you know, greater, I suppose, empathy and understanding throughout the organization and the workforce. You've seen those advocacy scores. You've seen the identification with the values and the purpose of an organization go up. Therefore, one could very sort of simply make the case that this is the sort of stuff that has to stay now. Otherwise, you are going to start to see things going down. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. And I think that where there was, you know, let's say formerly a reticence to, you know, offering people more because, oh, well, what if we can't sustain it? And people get upset when something feels like it's being taken away. You know, where are the threats there? You know, it's best just not to risk it and let's play it safe. Whereas, of course, over the last 6 months, let's say, playing it safe hasn't been an option. So, to switch gears, I suppose, to something that is very tangible, well, that's very kind of current, that's on everybody's radar, is this idea of flexible working. You've touched on it a little bit there, but to get back into the idea of, once you've sort of offered something, it's going to be more difficult to take it back. Does the research that you've done support the idea that flexible working is here to stay in sort of a larger format?
Yeah, I think, it's been a massive social experiment. And like you said before, some of these things have been in people's plans, but this is absolutely forced people to deliver on that. But it's still been an experiment. I think it's definitely here to stay in a larger format. But again, we need to recognize that not everybody is equipped to work flexibly. So we need to be really wary of the them and us elements. And also, I like the fact that you've used flexible rather than working from home, because it's not just about working from home for me. It's about, how do you just trust your people to get the job done? So measuring on outputs rather than time spent in the office, presenteeism. So whether it's in a co-working space or a coffee shop or wherever that might be, I think the flexibility element is the key. And I think it's down to kind of everybody to understand and embrace that hybrid model where possible, would be my view. Claire, anything to add?
I think that's spot on, Jo. And I think even some of the manufacturing companies we were talking to was still exploring what does flexibility mean for them. So some of them are definitely seeing a bit of them and us go on where if office employees have been able to work from home, and they're obviously people on the factory floor manufacturing weren't able to. In some organisations, they'd seen a bit of them and us happen, and so it was something they were conscious of and that they need to think about going forward. Others hadn't experienced that at all because of the quality of the conversation and the relationships that existed already across those organisations. I do think that you can still be flexible, in your manufacturing space. I think you just need to explore that with your people. What does that mean? Is it the way that shift patterns are created? Is it the way that they work in their team groups, etc.? So there is lots of opportunity. And I would hope that organisations would have seen this as it's a great big test and learn. I'm a massive advocate for testing and learning from stuff and then using it to build forward. So I do think it is going to be the future. I do think we will see more of it. I just hope organisations those that go back into the office don't see it as a nice warm comfy jumper that they've put on again and get back into old ways and old habits, because I think then for those employees who really do want flexibility, it could all disappear quite quickly, which would be a massive shame.
Yeah, and just on that, in terms of the office, and I think quite a few people we spoke to were already thinking of this. And again, it's back to kind of that strategy piece, but what is the role of the office? So historically, it's been, a lot of desk space, but a number of people that were planning on moving to new buildings anyway, or refurbishing or whatever, are creating more of a co-working space and a more of a collaboration space and a more of a space for events when we can eventually have them, of course. But appreciating that people have enjoyed the flexibility and actually having a hub or an anchor point for people to come together, rather than a rule that you need to go into the office every single day. So I think that's interesting from a property perspective.
Excellent. I think that you've mentioned sort of them and us a couple of times, and I've had it put to me as well that, there are some organizations, I'm glad you brought up manufacturing, because I think it's an area that I often hear referred to in terms of a company, or rather a sector that might want to embrace these things, but for whatever reason can't, or not necessarily won't, but certainly kind of culturally or whatever, just it's not been something that they've been ready to implement or to embrace, right? What would you say to somebody from companies in similar sectors to that who, for whatever reason, can't or won't be as flexible towards introducing these new ways of working?
Yeah, I think I would say talk to your people as well, like about how they want to work. So, whether it's shift patterns, whether you can build in some flexibility into contracts, whether you can multi-skill to enable more flexible working. I do also think that we need to recognize that some jobs just can't be done flexibly. So it's about how do you make it more enjoyable for people to come into the office, and not kind of a daily drudge, and take into account their views about how they want to be, and all the other things around engagement, rather than just the environment. So I think there's still things that people can do to listen to their people around flexibility, even if they have to come into a factory or be out with customers, etc., etc.
Yep.
Claire?
Excellent.
Yeah.
I've got nothing further to add on that, Joe. You took the words right out of my mouth about talk to your people, explore it with them.
Yeah. And I'd say that for everything, and I think the flexibility element for those, some companies don't want to do it either. So even, there's those that can't because of where people are based and the jobs that they do. But there are still some companies that don't want to move to flexible working, which I think is really interesting in terms of how they view their strategy, in terms of tapping into talent pools, in terms of engagement. So I think there's a couple of tensions that are going to arise there, which looking forward to seeing how it pans out, because there's also a tension. I will stop talking in a second, but there's a tension between people want flexibility. I think they've realized that they want more flexibility, but obviously you've got the economy and the economic situation with potential recession, potential job cuts. So are people actually just going to be thankful that they have a job and do whatever the organization says, or is there going to be more of a dialogue as to how people work in the future? I don't know the answer, and it could be very different across different organizations depending on what they're facing.
Yeah, no, and that is a really interesting point that you make, Joe, because I think even sort of, last year, I wrote a piece for Hive, and it was talking about how sort of certainly among kind of younger generations, the attitude with regards to employment has moved away from, oh, I'm lucky to be here, and it's more, you're lucky to have me. So, as we kind of see these attitudes becoming more prevalent, firstly, to your first point, are we going to see maybe a dilution of that attitude in relation to, just keeping your backside in your chair for, 6 to 12 months? Or is the potential there for organizations who have maybe embraced a more sort of future-facing attitude towards flexibility and all that kind of thing? Is this going to be sort of a bonanza for them as it relates to hoovering up all the talent? I mean, I don't know the answer to that either. And just for everybody listening, that is not, we haven't planned that at all. That's just off the cuff. It's definitely an interesting thing to think about.
I don't think anybody knows the answer.
No, absolutely not.
And what I've also heard, I don't know whether you guys, I don't know whether you guys have got a view on this, that kind of the younger generation, a lot of the younger generation actually really value those connections that they have in the office, and the face-to-face times. What we found is something around the collisions that people, and how valuable they are for the culture of the organization. So there's something to work on there about, so not just younger people, but all around, is how those collisions work in a more flexible virtual world.
100%. What do you think, Claire, in relation to kind of these, these organic moments of community, essentially, that just can't exist while we're all on Zooms and stuff with each other?
I think it's something that over time and over these last few months, organisations have realised how much they are the fabric of how they work. And I think then initially at the start of the crisis, I think a lot it was people recognised those things were happening, but saw them all as social things. So you heard about let's have the Friday morning bacon sandwich club, or the Wednesday night quiz, or the lunch and learns, that sort of things, the more social connections. But I actually think over time, and we explored this with quite a number of leaders we were talking to, just to see whether or not that was on their radar, and had they picked that up, and were they even noticing it themselves. I think we call them collisions, but it is the collisions that happen in the coffee shop or the restaurant or the smoking hut. They do still exist. The behind the bike sheds or whatever, just passing somebody in the corridor, or as you're parking your car, or walking into the office and reception. There's all sorts of moments where you connect with people who are not in your normal sphere of work. And they can be moments to connect, to have social connection, but they can also be quite creative. You can start talking about a topic with somebody, and it can spark some ideas. It can prompt you to resolve an issue, or work out that there's another person you need to go and speak to. But they also can be the sort of more informal routes for raising issues or concerns that you don't want to do in a formal way, or you might have a worry or concern about. All those sorts of things get sort of missed when we're totally working remotely. And I think that will have an impact, and it's how you think about that and how you design that in, which is why I don't believe everybody will constantly work from home. I think people will want to come together and have those collisions and those connections socially and in a more work environment as well. And I think organisations need them. Organisations' culture is really a whole load of interactions between each other and people. And if all those interactions are just through a video and not face to face, or as you bump into people, I know we can't actually bump into people anymore, but you know what I mean. Socially distanced bumping into each other. I think they're going to have to come back in some form, you know, and there will be virtual ways of doing that, and they will have to be manufactured into ways of working. And I think there will be ways of making that more effective. But I do think it's something that I don't think leaders recognised early doors in a crisis, and why would they and why should they? But actually, as it went on, I think they were recognising it for themselves, that they weren't seeing teams and certain people if they weren't in their remit, and actually they would normally be connecting with others. So I think from top to bottom, organisations will be missing that.
Absolutely. It ties into actually with this phrase that you had when we did the prep call, Joe. You talked about culture by intention and not by accident, and that really kind of has stayed with me, and I think it ties nicely into what Claire was talking about. But could you just unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, I love that. I love that phrase too, because culture happens whether you like it or not, whether you've designed it or not. As Claire said, it's created through those everyday interactions of people. You know, by the processes that we put around the organization, and by what's kind of allowed and not allowed, all of those unwritten rules, as it were. So it's there whether we like it or not. So kind of if you don't pay attention about what you want your culture to look like, it'll happen. So be very intentional about what you're trying to create. And I see culture as an output rather than an input. You know, there's inputs in terms of behaviors, processes, governance, controls, etc., that all create this culture. So if you be very intentional about what you want that culture to look like at the end, and then look at the inputs and what's creating that, and how do you shift them, how do you change them to create that new culture that you want, or maintain the culture that you've got, and what do you actually take away that is maybe hampering your culture. You know, if you want a culture of innovation, for example, you know, taking away some governance, taking away some of those controls would be very powerful, and the stories that you tell, etc. So let's not just let culture happen by accident. Let's be intentional about what we want to create, and therefore how we kind of create it, if that makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Yes. Thank you for that. I suppose in terms of an input then, and the effect that it would have on the culture inside an organization, health and safety, right? That's a big thing these days. Yeah,
it is. Yeah.
So, you know, it used to be the case that, I mean, you know, you think about things like near misses and, you know, recording a trip and a fall on a sheet and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, procedurally, I can see that was all very necessary, right? But just if I think about what has to happen for me to get to work on the days that I do come in the office, it's, you know, drive to the metro, put my mask on, hand sanitize on the metro, hand sanitize off the metro, have my mask on as I'm walking down the street, come into the office, hand sanitize, take my temperature, write that down on the attendance sheet, get to my desk, antibacterial everything. Then I have to do my day's work. Like, I totally understand why that is. I want to keep myself and everybody around me safe, right? That's just what we want to do as good people. But are we creating an atmosphere, or rather a culture inside organizations of, like, are we just teaching people to be careful, or are we teaching people to be scared in a way? And, you know, where does that sort of nerfing of everything, like where's the intersection between we want to keep you safe and then, but we also want you to be self-sufficient? Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it is really difficult, isn't it? I mean, we all should know all the best practice now. We've had 6 months of knowing. You've just described it off pat, you know. Do you need all the reminders and all the signs up and everything else to remind you that that's, you know, that's good practice and that keeps you and your colleagues safe? I don't know. I think it is really important, and putting the health and safety and well-being of employees at the top of agendas, you know, is really, really important. It is, isn't it? And you know, I wouldn't argue with that at all. I think my take on it is, and it goes to Joe's point about being intentional about your culture and the thinking about an intervention, and it's a massive intervention for all sorts of organisations, isn't it? And within our lives, all this stuff to do with hand sanitising and wearing masks and keeping our distance, etc. And it's all designed to help. I think it's how it gets implemented. I think you've got to be paying attention to and really thinking about. I think there's a danger that organisations, because they are putting people first and panicking maybe to a little degree about, we don't want them to spread COVID within the organisation, we don't want them to catch it, we don't want them, you know, we want to keep them safe. You could tend to become a bit like the parents, and your employees are a bit like your child. And so I think that can bleed into a little bit in terms of how you design those safety interventions, the language you use, you know. And I think it's just I feel like it's a little watch out for organisations is if you've got, you know, don't allow it to become a parent-child organisation, because even if it's temporary, it's still intentional and it'll still have some impact on your culture that you'll have to unwind at some point. So I think being careful about the language you use and the style of language, the words you use, and help people feel like adults that are being given advice, but they can make their own and the right choices, because actually they know the right decisions anyway. And I think there's a danger as well of disempowering leaders and team leaders in something like this. Actually let them work it out with their teams, the best way to organise themselves, the best way to be sitting apart, etc., what will work for them. You don't feel like you have to take every decision for the whole organisation as a project team delivering health and safety. It is something to just be mindful of. I'm sure most organisations are, and they're not, you know, making it feel like a total set of rules and making people feel like children when they walk into the office or the workspace. But I know this is one of your things as well, Joe. I don't know whether you want to add anything.
Yeah, health and safety is a really interesting one, isn't it? I think I was just reflecting as you were talking there as well, Claire. So Claire and I had a lot to do with health and safety and language when we worked in corporate world and shifting that. But those are things like, you know, reverse parking because it's safer to drive out of a space than back into a space. Holding the handrail as you walk down the stairs and things like that. So, you know, historically health and safety has been quite parent-child in terms of telling you what to do and what not to do. I also think there's something though about people want some guidance at the moment. You know, it's a very uncertain world, and you know, obviously we all know the dangers of COVID, and people actually want their organization to say, actually, this is what we're going to do and this is best practice. I think the danger is them just taking that too far, and how you enforce it. So, you know, Claire, I totally agree with you in terms of leaders and their teams getting together, figuring out the best way to do it, and keeping that element of empowerment within a framework, if you like.
Mm-hmm. And essentially, I think I suppose making it something of a spectrum as well. I mean, I've seen examples in an organization, I'll give them a shout out actually, at the FSCS, for example. They've brought in a thing where part of their sort of welcome backpack as it relates to go to work is they have 3 little jelly bracelets, red, yellow and green, and you wear the color that corresponds to your sort of anxiety level or to your like
Yeah.
openness to having other people interact with you. So if you're a
Yeah.
green, you could be, you know, someone could stand quite close to you, maybe give you a high five. But if you're a red, it's, you know, please make sure you keep your distance. I might be shielding or a little bit more worried or whatever it might be. So I've seen that as being sort of a, you know, quite a, you know, a pretty simple but yet quite effective way to give people the choice as to how they interact back in the workplace. And I think secondly, to your point there, Joe, to kind of to agree that people do want a bit of a steer about what the best policy is and to kind of feel a bit of certainty. I think because, you know, not to get political, but I think we've all understood recently that things can be a little bit confusing at the best of times, you know, maybe not make the most sense. So yeah, I think that where an organization can maybe be that source of, let's say, consistent information, you know, I think that could only benefit them.
Ben, are we getting political here, or do we stay away from that in your podcast?
No, you can say whatever you want on this podcast. It's fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think not too political there. That was a safe answer. No. I think we'll do that. Cool. Well, you've both been very generous with your time. I have sort of one more multi-threaded question to ask, if I may. And it's just for the people listening to this, really, who, you know, they've enjoyed everything and they after maybe a little bit of a summing up. So what's like one thing that a company could start doing today that would make a difference to their culture? And I guess the follow-up question for that would be like more widely, how could an HR practitioner sort of make sure that they're seizing this moment in time and that they're not letting any opportunities pass them by?
Do you want to go first, Claire?
Go on then. It's a good question. It is a good question. I think in terms of HR teams, I think that they're massively involved in everything that's going on at the moment. So I think it's a great opportunity to influence and to really put your stamp on your organisation. But I definitely would make sure you've taken the moment and the opportunity to really understand what you've learned from a people and behaviour and organisational engagement perspective, and really think about, as you start to put your plans together for next year and you start to look at what's going on, is use this moment in time to really understand what's been going on and what you can learn from, and what you can take forward. And then I think just generally, you know, if I was advising all organisations, it's a build on that, I suppose, but be really intentional about those behaviours and those changes. Don't leave it to chance. You've got to keep reimagining how your organisation can shape up and what it can look like in the future, but be intentional about it.
Love it.
Oh, good ones, Claire. Good ones. I would say from an HR perspective, as you said, Claire, they're in a unique position. So joining the dots across areas, across strategy, across functions, because HR often got to see, you know, the multiple levels of the system, as it were. So that would be the HR one. Then the wider organisation piece, I would say, include your people, talk to your people, listen to them, take action, involve them as much as you possibly can in what the future looks like. Two reasons. One is, I guess, that, you know, if people are involved in change, they're much more likely to accept it and it'll work. So that's one. And then two is that conversations change things as well as actions. So conversations and joint sense making can create massive change. And if you bring your people together and get involved in that, I think that's where real change can happen.
Fantastic. I think that's some excellent points to end the show with. So Claire, Joe, thank you very much for joining me. For anybody who wants to hear more about you, I was going to say you guys again, but I'm trying to be better. Hear about you both, you folks, you peeps, and maybe hear a bit more about Curious Jellyfish as well. Is LinkedIn the best place for them to reach you for a first initial hello? Yes,
absolutely. We've got a company page on LinkedIn. We've got a website, www.curiousjellyfish.com. Happy to just have a bit of a chat, bit of a call, whatever people would like. And yeah, love to make connections.
Fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Excellent.
Ben.
Well, thank you both very much for joining me.
Thanks, Ben. Enjoyed that. It's a great conversation.
Great. I'll speak to you both soon.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.